Sometimes I wonder if my father ever saw me as his daughter, or just as a backup plan, an insurance policy he could cash in when things got rough. If I had known how everything would unfold, would I still have helped him? Maybe. Maybe not. But I know one thing for certain: I'll never allow anyone to use me like that again. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. They say time heals all wounds, but some cuts run too deep for simple healing. They change you, reshape who you are at your core. My name is Vanessa Pierce, and this is the story of how I saved my father's legacy only to be erased from it entirely. Growing up in Portland, I always believed that family meant something sacred. That blood ties were unbreakable bonds. That my father, the great Theodore Ted Pierce, respected me even if he didn't always show it. I spent 32 years chasing that belief before I finally understood the truth. It's strange how clarity comes to you at the most unexpected moments. For me, it wasn't during the countless family dinners where my achievements went unacknowledged. It wasn't during my college graduation when my father spent the ceremony answering emails. It wasn't even when he rewrote his will after I saved his company, cutting me out completely. No, my moment of clarity came on an ordinary Tuesday morning, sitting on my porch, watching the sunrise with a cup of coffee in my hand. My phone buzzed with yet another call from my father's number, the 15th that week. I stared at the screen, feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no hurt, no obligation. Just peaceful emptiness. That's when I knew I was finally free. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how I reached that moment of perfect detachment, you need to know what came before. My father built Pierce Manufacturing from nothing. A small machine shop in 1985 became a regional powerhouse by the time I was born in 1991. His rags-to-riches story was legendary in our community, the son of a factory worker who created an empire through guts and grit, as he loved to say. By my 10th birthday, Pierce Manufacturing had 3 facilities across the Pacific Northwest and over 200 employees. The company was everything to him, more important than his golf game, which he took very seriously. More important than his social standing, which he monitored obsessively. More important than his wife, my mother Rebecca, who learned early to live in his shadow. And certainly more important than his children, my older brother Nathan and me. Our roles were defined before we could even understand them. Nathan was the heir apparent, groomed from childhood to take over Pierce Manufacturing. I was, well, the contingency plan, the backup, the safety net in case Nathan failed. I remember sitting at dinner one night when I was 12, listening to my father talk about how Nathan would lead the company to new heights someday. I'd just won the state math competition and was eager to share my own accomplishment. Maybe I could help run the company too, Dad, I suggested, my certificate still tucked in my backpack by the door. Mrs. Lewis says I have a natural head for numbers. My father's laugh wasn't cruel, just dismissive. He reached over to pat my head, not even looking away from Nathan as he did. Princess, you don't need to worry about the business. You'll do just fine when you find a nice husband. Women don't need the stress of running companies. They need to focus on building families. I smiled through the sting, pretending his words didn't matter. My mother caught my eye across the table, her expression a practiced blend of sympathy and resignation. She gave a slight shake of her head, a warning not to push further. I learned that lesson quickly. In the Pierce household, knowing your place was essential to keeping the peace. When I was 18, I received acceptance letters from several prestigious universities. My father insisted I attend the University of Washington, close enough to home, but with a strong enough reputation. Business administration, he decided, despite my interest in finance and economics. You'll need to understand the basics. If you ever marry someone in the industry. I went to Stanford instead, on a partial scholarship that I supplemented by working part-time. I double majored in economics and computer science, and I paid for it myself. It was my first real act of defiance, and I still remember the look on my father's face when I told him. Confusion mixed with irritation, as if I'd broken some unspoken rule. "Stanford?" he'd said, frowning. "What's the point of going all the way to California when there are perfectly good schools here?" "It's one of the best universities in the country, Dad," I'd replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's unnecessary," he replied. "And expensive. I have a scholarship, and I'll cover the rest." He'd stared at me for a long moment, then shrugged. "Suit yourself. It's your time to waste." That dismissal hurt worse than anger would have. But I went anyway, and those 4 years at Stanford changed everything for me. Away from my father's shadow, I discovered who I was. I excelled in my classes, built a network of like-minded friends, and secured an internship at a prestigious financial consulting firm in San Francisco. Meanwhile, back home, Nathan was trying to live up to our father's impossible expectations. He'd joined Pierce Manufacturing straight out of college as planned, working his way through different departments in a carefully orchestrated rise to leadership. But Nathan had always been better at playing the part of the devoted son than actually running a business. He could charm clients over dinner but struggled with the hard decisions that kept a company profitable. I kept tabs on Pierce Manufacturing through my mother's occasional calls. The company was expanding, new facilities, larger contracts, but there were whispers of trouble. Cash flow problems, quality control issues, management conflicts. My father, ever the optimist about his own creation, dismissed these as growing pains. Nathan, eager to please, echoed this sentiment. After graduating summa cum laude, I was offered a position at Maxwell Financial Advisors in San Francisco. I built a reputation as someone who could turn struggling companies around, identifying inefficiencies, restructuring debt, streamlining operations. By 30, I had my own corner office and a client list that included several Fortune 500 companies. My success brought me a sense of validation that I'd never received at home. My father acknowledged my career with the same vague praise he might give to a distant acquaintance. "Doing well for yourself out there, I hear," he'd say during holiday visits, before immediately turning the conversation back to Nathan or the company. My mother would squeeze my hand under the table, her silent way of saying she was proud, even if she couldn't say it aloud. Nathan's wedding in 2018 brought me back to Portland for an extended visit. During the reception, after several whiskeys, my father pulled me aside. "The company's doing well," he said, his voice just a little too insistent to be casual. "Really well." "That's good to hear," I replied, watching him carefully. "Some cash flow issues, but that's normal with expansion. Nothing to worry about." I nodded, recognizing the familiar rhythm of my father talking himself into believing something. "If you ever need an outside perspective," I offered cautiously. "I do this kind of thing for a living now." He'd laughed, clapping me on the shoulder, a little too hard. "We're just fine, Princess. Your brother's got a good head on his shoulders." I let it drop. I'd extended the olive branch. If he didn't want to take it, that was his choice. 2 years passed. I saw my family only during major holidays, and even those visits grew shorter each time. It wasn't that I didn't love them. I did, despite everything. But being in that house, falling back into old patterns, made me feel like I was slowly suffocating. Then came the call that changed everything. It was a Thursday morning in November 2020. I was preparing for a client meeting when my phone rang with my father's number. "Vanessa," he said, his voice tense. "No greeting, no pleasantries. We need to talk, not over the phone." "I'm in the middle of something, Dad. Can it wait until—" "It's about the company. It's important." Something in his tone made me pause. In 29 years, I'd never heard Theodore Pierce admit that anything was important enough to interrupt someone else's schedule. "What's going on?" "Not over the phone," he repeated. "Can you come up this weekend?" I rearranged my schedule, booked a flight, and arrived in Portland by Friday evening. My mother met me at the door, her face drawn with worry. "He's in his study," she said quietly, embracing me with thin arms. "It's bad, Vanessa." "How bad?" She just shook her head. My father's study had always been his sanctuary, a place where decisions were made and announcements delivered. As a child, being summoned there usually meant you were in trouble. As an adult, it felt no less intimidating. He sat behind his massive oak desk, a stack of folders in front of him. Nathan sat in one of the visitor chairs, leg bouncing nervously, a glass of something amber in his hand despite the early hour. My father looked older than I remembered, the lines in his face deeper, his typically impeccable appearance slightly rumpled. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the empty chair beside Nathan. I remained standing. "What's going on?" My father exchanged a glance with Nathan before speaking. "Pierce Manufacturing is in trouble." "What kind of trouble?" "Financial trouble?" "Serious financial trouble." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. I wasn't surprised, not really, but I was surprised he was finally admitting it. "How serious?" He pushed one of the folders toward me. "See for yourself." I flipped it open and began scanning the documents inside. Balance sheets, profit and loss statements, cash flow projections. Each page told the same story. Pierce Manufacturing was on the brink of collapse. Excessive debt, declining revenue, failed expansion attempts, mismanaged contracts. It was worse than I could have imagined. "You're looking at bankruptcy within 6 months," I said, closing the folder. My father nodded grimly. "That's our assessment as well." "How did it get this bad?" Nathan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. My father's jaw tightened. "That's not important right now. What matters is fixing it." I almost laughed. Not important? Years of poor decisions, ignored warnings, and financial mismanagement had brought a once-thriving company to its knees, and he didn't think understanding how it happened was important? "Actually, Dad, it's extremely important. You don't treat a disease without diagnosing it first." "We don't need metaphors, Vanessa," my father snapped. "We need solutions. You work with struggling companies all the time. You know how to fix these things." And there it was, the real reason for the summons. Not because he valued my insight or respected my expertise, because he needed something from me. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Help us restructure. Bring in investors. Use your connections to secure emergency funding." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Save the company. That's not a small ask, Dad. We're talking about potentially millions of dollars in debt, complete operational restructuring, probably significant layoffs." "You think I don't know that?" he interrupted. 253 people depend on Pierce Manufacturing for their livelihoods. Your brother's future depends on it. Your mother and I, our retirement. "And what about my career?" I asked quietly. "Helping you would mean putting my own clients on hold, possibly damaging relationships I've spent years building." "This is family, Vanessa. Family comes first." I almost laughed again. "Family comes first? Since when?" "Since he needed something." "From me?" I looked at Nathan, who hadn't said a word since I arrived. "What do you think happened?" He swirled his drink, not meeting my eyes. "The Westlake expansion was bigger than we anticipated. Then the Jensen contract fell through. The pandemic hit our supply chain. It was a perfect storm. A perfect storm of incompetence, more likely. But I kept that thought to myself. I turned back to my father. "If I do this, And that's a big if. I need complete transparency and full authority to make necessary changes. No questioning my decisions. No undermining my strategies. Now wait a minute, my father began, his face darkening. Those are my terms. Take them or find someone else. We stared at each other across the desk, engaged in a silent battle of wills. For the first time in my life, I wasn't backing down. Finally, he nodded. Fine. Do what you need to do. I should have walked away. I should have wished them luck and returned to my life in San Francisco. I had no obligation to rescue a company that had never been meant for me, led by a brother who had been handed every opportunity I'd had to fight for, owned by a father who had never truly seen me. But some small, stubborn part of me, the part that still longed for my father's approval, that still wanted to prove my worth, couldn't turn away. Maybe this was it. Maybe saving Pierce Manufacturing would finally make him see me as more than just the backup plan. I'll need full access to all financial records, I said, making mental notes of what I'd need. Complete organizational charts, customer contracts, vendor agreements, everything. You'll have it, my father promised, and I'll need to bring in my own team, people I trust. He frowned but nodded again. I'll start on Monday. As I turned to leave, my father called after me. Vanessa. I paused at the door, looking back. For a moment, I thought I saw something like gratitude in his eyes. But then it was gone, replaced by his usual businesslike expression. Thank you, he said stiffly, as if the words themselves caused him physical discomfort. It wasn't much. But at the time, it felt like the closest thing to approval I'd ever received from Theodore Pierce. Little did I know that this moment, this decision to help, would lead me down a path that would ultimately sever my connection to my family forever. But as I walked out of that study, all I felt was determination. I was finally being given a chance to prove myself, and prove myself I would, in ways none of us could have anticipated. The Pierce family home stood on Hillcrest Avenue, a sprawling, colonial with white columns and perfectly manicured hedges. It was the house my father had built after Pierce Manufacturing landed its first major contract, a physical manifestation of his success that he'd never let anyone forget, came from nothing. I spent the weekend after our meeting combing through company records, working from my old bedroom that had long since been converted into a tasteful guest room. Any traces of my childhood, the science fair ribbons, the dog-eared economics books, the Stanford pennant, had been neatly packed away years ago. My mother had apologized when showing me to the room, explaining they needed the space, though for what remained unclear. The room sat unused most of the year. The financial records told a story far worse than my father had admitted. Pierce Manufacturing hadn't just hit a rough patch. It had been systematically mismanaged for years. The Westlake expansion Nathan had mentioned was a disaster from the start, built on overly optimistic projections and financed through high-interest loans. Equipment purchases had been made without proper capital planning. Contracts had been signed without adequate cost analysis. What struck me most wasn't just the poor decisions, but the pattern they formed. Every major mistake shared a common thread. My father overriding recommendations from his financial advisors, convinced he knew better. And Nathan, eager to please, backing him every time. I was still awake at 3 a.m. Sunday morning when I heard a soft knock at the door. My mother entered wearing a silk robe and carrying 2 mugs of chamomile tea. I saw the light under your door, she said, setting 1 mug on the nightstand beside me. You always work too hard. I rubbed my eyes, leaning back from the laptop. Someone has to. She sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to disturb the papers spread across the comforter. How bad is it? I considered sugarcoating it, then decided against it. My mother had always been more perceptive than people gave her credit for. It's bad, Mom. Really bad. The company's bleeding money, and has been for years. She nodded slowly. as if this confirmed something she'd long suspected. Your father won't admit it, but he's terrified. I've never seen him like this. He should be terrified. The company could go under in months without drastic intervention. She studied me over, the rim of her mug. And you can fix it? Maybe. It won't be pretty. There will need to be cuts, reorganization, new management practices. I hesitated before adding, Nathan will need to step back. She winced slightly at that. Your father won't like that. Dad's going to have to accept a lot of things he doesn't, like if he wants the company to survive. We sat in silence for a moment. The only sound was the occasional rustling of papers when the ceiling fan hit them just right. You know, my mother said finally, he does respect you, in his way. He brags about you to his friends, his daughter, the financial whiz in San Francisco. I looked up, surprised. He does, she nodded. He just doesn't know how to show it to your face. He's complicated. That's one word for it. She smiled faintly, then grew serious again. Whatever happens with the company, try to remember he's still your father. Is he? The words slipped out before I could stop them. Because sometimes it feels like I'm just an employee he calls in when there's a crisis. My mother reached out to touch my hand, her fingers cool against mine. Family is complex, Vanessa. Nobody gets it right all the time. Some get it wrong more than others. She didn't argue with that. Instead, she stood and kissed the top of my head, like she used to when I was a child. Get some sleep. You'll need your strength. After she left, I stared at the financial statements. A while longer, thinking about what she'd said. My father bragging about me. It seemed almost comical. This man who had barely acknowledged my achievements to my face, supposedly proud when I wasn't around to hear it. The next morning, I found Nathan in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee and looking like he hadn't slept much either. Morning, he mumbled as I entered. I grabbed a mug from the cabinet, noticing it wasn't in the same place it had been when I lived here, and poured myself coffee from the expensive machine that had replaced our old drip brewer. We need to talk, I said, sitting across from him. Nathan sighed. About how I screwed everything up? The directness surprised me. Nathan had always been the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed things over, rarely admitting fault. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. He ran a hand through his hair, which was already showing traces of gray at 35. I know what the numbers look like. What happened, Nate? He stared into his coffee. I tried to be him. That was my first mistake. Dad? Who else? The great Theodore Pierce. There was a bitterness in his voice I'd never heard before. I thought if I made the same moves he would have made, he would have taken the same risks. Dad built the company, in a different era, I said carefully. Different market conditions, different competition. Try telling him that. Nathan looked up, meeting my eyes. You got out, Can. You built your own thing. I've been trying to live up to his legacy my entire life. For a moment, I saw my brother clearly, not as the golden child who had been handed everything, but as someone trapped in a role he hadn't chosen and couldn't escape. There was a strange solidarity in that realization, a recognition that we had both, in our own ways, been shaped by our father's expectations. Help me fix this, I said quietly. Not for him, for the company, for the employees. Nathan studied me for a long moment before nodding. What do you need? Complete honesty. No more covering up problems to please Dad. No more optimistic projections when the data doesn't support them. He won't like that. That's not your problem anymore. A small smile touched his lips. When did my little sister get so tough? Around the time I realized no one was going to fight my battles for me. The kitchen door swung open, and our father entered, already dressed in slacks and a button-down despite it being Sunday. He paused, taking in the scene, his two children, huddled in conversation without him. "Morning," he said gruffly. "Discussing strategy already?" "Just catching up," I replied smoothly. Nathan was filling me in on some details about operations. My father nodded, seemingly satisfied with that answer. Good. I've called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning, 9 sharp. They need to hear your plan." "I don't have a plan yet, Dad. I've barely scratched the surface of understanding the full situation." He waved this off as if it were a minor detail. "You've had the financials since Friday. That's plenty of time." "For a preliminary assessment, yes. Not a comprehensive turnaround strategy." "Well, they're expecting something tomorrow." He poured himself coffee, adding nothing to it. "Don't worry. They know you're the expert. They'll listen." And there it was. The impossible standard. The expectation that I would perform miracles on demand, without adequate time or information. It was so familiar it almost made me laugh. "I'll put together an initial assessment," I conceded. "But I'm not promising miracle solutions overnight." "That's my girl." He clapped me on the shoulder as he passed, the brief contact almost startling. "Always under-promise and over-deliver. Smart business." After he left, Nathan looked at me with something like sympathy. "Welcome back to the family business." "I'm not back," I corrected him. "I'm here to consult, temporarily." But even as I said it, I wondered if it was true. The gravitational pull of family obligation was strong, and I'd already begun to feel myself getting drawn back into old patterns. The desire to please, the need to prove myself, the instinct to smooth things over. I spent the rest of Sunday meeting with key personnel. The CFO, a nervous man named Clark who seemed terrified. I would blame him personally for the company's troubles. The operations manager, Sandra, who spoke candidly about inefficiencies in the production process, and the sales director, Martin, who admitted that several major clients were threatening to take their business elsewhere. With each conversation, the picture became clearer. Pierce Manufacturing wasn't just suffering from financial mismanagement, but from a culture of fear. No one wanted to be the bearer of bad news to Theodore Pierce. Problems weren't addressed until they became crises. Warnings went unheeded. By Sunday evening, I had enough information to formulate a preliminary strategy. I worked late into the night, preparing slides and projections, knowing that no matter how dire the reality, I would need to present a path forward that inspired confidence. The board meeting on Monday morning was held in the company's conference room, a space designed to impress, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Portland and a massive table made from a single slab of redwood. I'd been in this room only once before, during a company holiday party years ago. Now, 10 pairs of eyes turned to me as my father introduced me. "As you all know, Vanessa has made quite a name for herself in financial restructuring," he said, his tone suggesting he'd been closely following my career all along. "We're fortunate she's agreed to step in and help us weather this temporary situation." I connected my laptop to the projector and took a deep breath. "Thank you for meeting on such short notice. I'll be direct. Pierce Manufacturing is in serious financial trouble." For the next hour, I walked them through my assessment, the cash flow problems, the unsustainable debt, the operational inefficiencies, the market position. I didn't sugarcoat it, but I also presented a clear, if difficult, path forward. In short, the company can be saved, I concluded, but it will require significant changes: debt restructuring, operational streamlining, potentially staff reductions, and, I paused, knowing this would be the most controversial point, a transition in leadership. The room went silent. My father, who had been nodding along up to this point, suddenly stiffened. "What exactly do you mean by that?" one of the board members asked. "To secure new investment and restore confidence, we need to demonstrate that Pierce Manufacturing is evolving. That means fresh perspectives in key leadership positions." My father cleared his throat. I think what Vanessa means is that we might bring in some additional executive talent to supplement our current team. No, I said firmly, meeting his gaze across the table. That's not what I mean. I'm recommending a new CEO, someone with turnaround experience, to guide the company through this transition period. Nathan would remain involved as Chief Strategy Officer, focusing on the areas where he excels. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. My father's face flushed red, but before he could speak, one of the board members, Janet Fletcher, who had known my father for decades, intervened. Let's hear the rest of the plan before we discuss specific personnel. Changes? She suggested smoothly. Vanessa, what's your timeline for implementation? Grateful for the redirect, I outlined the next steps. Approaching creditors to renegotiate terms, identifying key positions that could be consolidated, developing a new marketing strategy to retain wavering clients. I've prepared a detailed document with projections for each phase, I said, distributing folders around the table. The short version is this. With immediate implementation, we could see positive cash flow within 6 months. Profitability might take a year, maybe more, but it's achievable. The meeting continued for another hour, with board members asking detailed questions that I was mostly able to answer. Throughout it all, my father remained unusually quiet, his expression unreadable. When the meeting finally adjourned, most of the board seemed cautiously optimistic. Several members approached me individually, expressing support for my plan, including the leadership changes, though they were careful to say this out of my father's earshot. I was packing up my materials when my father approached, his movements stiff. My office. Now. I followed him down the hallway to the corner office he'd occupied for as long as I could remember. The space was a testament to his career. Awards. Lining the walls, photos with politicians and business leaders, the leather furniture and mahogany desk projecting an image of unwavering authority. He closed the door behind us with more force than necessary. "What the hell was that?" he demanded. That was me telling the truth about what's needed to save this company. By suggesting I step down, that Nathan be demoted, in front of the entire board. Leadership changes are necessary, Dad. The bank won't extend more credit without them. Potential investors won't consider, "This is my company," he interrupted, voice rising. "Built with my sweat and blood, and you waltz in here after one weekend of looking at spreadsheets and decide you know better than me how to run it." I forced myself to stay calm. "I know better than you how to save it. There's a difference. You've always been like this, you know that? Always thinking you're smarter than everyone else? That's not what this is about, isn't it?" He paced. The office, agitation visible in every movement. You couldn't just come in and help. You had to make it about proving yourself, showing up your brother, embarrassing me in front of my own board. The injustice of his accusations stung. I've spent the last 48 hours doing nothing but trying to help you, at considerable cost to my own career. I presented a plan that could actually work, based on my professional expertise. If your ego can't handle that— My ego? He stopped pacing to face me. This isn't about my ego. This is about respect, about loyalty, about understanding what family means. Family, I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. You want to talk about family? When have you ever treated me like family, Dad? When have you ever respected my achievements or supported my choices? You only called me when you needed something, when your golden boy couldn't fix the mess you created together. His face darkened. If that's how you feel, maybe you should go back to San Francisco. We'll find another way. For a moment, I was tempted to take him up on it, to walk away and let them figure it out themselves. But I thought about the employees, whose livelihoods depended on Pierce Manufacturing. I thought about my mother, who had built her life around this family and this company. I even thought about Nathan, trapped in a role he was never suited for. "No," I said finally. "I said I would help, and I will. But not on your terms. Not by pretending problems don't exist or that solutions won't be painful. If you want my help, you get all of me, my expertise, my connections, and my honesty. We stared at each other across the office, decades of unspoken resentments and expectations hanging in the air between us. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. Fine. Do what you think is best. His tone made it clear this was a concession, not an endorsement. But remember one thing, Vanessa. When all this is over, when the dust settles, this is still a family company. And in families, we don't forget who was loyal and who wasn't. It wasn't quite a threat, but it wasn't quite not one either. As I left his office, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just set something in motion that couldn't be undone. A reckoning that had been brewing for years. What I didn't know then was how right I was, and how ill-prepared I was for what would come next. The first week of trying to save Pierce Manufacturing passed in a blur of meetings, late nights, and endless cups of coffee. I commandeered a small conference room as my temporary office, walls soon covered with financial projections and organizational charts. My team from San Francisco, Alex, my trusted analyst, and Melissa, a debt restructuring specialist, joined me by Wednesday, bringing fresh eyes and outside perspectives that the company desperately needed. The employees watched us with a mixture of hope and suspicion. I was Ted's daughter to them, an outsider despite my bloodline, someone who had abandoned the family business to build her own career. Now I was back, wielding spreadsheets like weapons, asking uncomfortable questions about efficiency and redundancy. My father kept his distance, at least publicly. He attended the necessary meetings, nodded at the appropriate moments, but said little. His silence was more unnerving than his anger had been. Theodore Pierce was many things, but quiet was rarely one of them. Nathan, surprisingly, became my strongest ally. He knew the company inside and out, its history, its people, its processes. While he lacked the financial acumen to have prevented the crisis, he had a wealth of institutional knowledge that proved invaluable. More importantly, he seemed genuinely ready for change. "I should have called you sooner," he admitted one night as we worked late, takeout containers scattered across the conference table. "I knew things were bad a year ago, but Dad kept saying it would turn around if we just landed the Harrington contract, or if we just pushed through the Westlake expansion." "He's always been an optimist," I said, more charitable than I felt. Nathan snorted. "Optimist is one word for it. Delusional might be another." He rubbed his eyes, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. "You know what's funny? I never wanted this." "The company?" He nodded. "I wanted to teach history. I had a professor in college who made the Civil War come alive. Primary sources, battlefield tours, the works. I thought, man, that's what I want to do. This was news to me. You never said anything. To who? Dad?" He laughed without humor. "Can you imagine? Hey, Dad, I don't want your life's work. I want to make 30 grand a year talking about Gettysburg to bored freshmen." I could in fact imagine exactly how that conversation would have gone. Poorly. "It's not too late, you know," I said. "After we stabilize things here, you could still—" "Nah." He cut me off with a wave. "That ship sailed a long time ago. You make your choices, you live with them." He smiled ruefully. "Besides, someone has to keep an eye on the old man while you're off conquering the financial world." The conversation stayed with me long after we'd called it a night. I'd always seen Nathan as the favored child, the one who got everything handed to him while I fought for recognition. Now I wondered if he'd been trapped in his own way, fulfilling a destiny he never chose, living up to expectations he never set for himself. Friday afternoon brought another board meeting. This time, I presented concrete actions already taken. Renegotiated terms with two major creditors, identified $1.2 million in immediate cost savings, and secured tentative interest from a potential investor. The board seemed cautiously optimistic. Even my father grudgingly acknowledged the progress. "Good work this week," he said afterward, the closest thing to a compliment I'd received from him in years. "Keep it up." That evening, my mother insisted. I joined them for dinner at home. A proper meal, not takeout at your desk. Too tired to argue, I agreed. The Pierce family home had always been a showplace more than a home. My mother refreshed the decor every few years to stay current with design trends, the furniture more for looking at than sitting on. The dining room, with its crystal chandelier and hand-painted chinoiserie wallpaper, could have been featured in a magazine. Growing up, we'd eaten most meals here, even on ordinary weeknights, one of my father's many rules. The dining room was for dining, the living room was for living. Bedrooms were for sleeping, not playing. Each space with its designated purpose, just as each family member had their designated role. My mother had prepared pot roast, my father's favorite. The familiar smell triggered a cascade of memories. Sunday dinners, holiday meals, countless evenings of carefully polite conversation interspersed with my father's business anecdotes. The three of us sat at the oversized table, the empty fourth place setting a reminder of adult life's scheduling realities. "Nathan will try to stop by for dessert," my mother explained, passing the potatoes. "He's showing the Hendersons the riverfront facility." My father nodded approvingly. "Good. Jim Henderson's son is taking a larger role in their operations. Nathan needs to build that relationship." The conversation flowed around safe topics: local news, an upcoming charity gala my mother was helping organize, a new restaurant downtown that had received glowing reviews. It was pleasant, superficial, and entirely devoid of mention of the company's precarious situation or my role in addressing it. As my mother served coffee and prepared to plate the apple pie cooling, on the sideboard my father cleared his throat. "Your mother and I have been talking," he began, folding his napkin precisely, "about your recommendations for the company, the leadership changes, specifically." I set down my water glass, suddenly alert. And we think it makes sense. For me to step back, that is. The words seemed to cost him something. "A phased transition. I'll remain as chairman, but we'll bring in a new CEO. Someone with turnaround experience, as you suggested." This was a major concession, one I hadn't expected. "That's good. The right decision. We have someone in mind already, Jack Forrester." I recognized the name immediately. Jack Forrester had successfully led several manufacturing companies through difficult transitions. He had a sterling reputation in the industry. He was also one of my father's oldest friends and golfing buddies. "Jack's experienced," I acknowledged carefully. "But given the situation, we should consider multiple candidates. Run a proper search." My father waved this off. "Jack knows the business. He knows our customers. And most importantly, he knows how we operate." That was precisely what worried me. "Dad, one of the issues with Pierce Manufacturing is how it operates. We need fresh perspectives, not more of the same." "Jack isn't more of the same," my father countered, an edge creeping into his voice. "He turned Westbrook Industries around in 18 months. That was 10 years ago, and Westbrook's issues were very different from ours. So you're the expert on Jack Forrester now?" I took a steady breath. "I'm saying we should consider multiple candidates before making such a critical decision. And I'm saying Jack is the right choice." The flatness in my father's tone indicated he considered the matter settled. My mother, ever the peacemaker, intervened. "The pie is ready. Theodore, would you like ice cream with yours?" The subject was dropped, at least temporarily. But as we ate dessert, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was a pattern repeating itself, my father appearing to concede, only to maintain control in a different way. Bringing in Jack Forrester wouldn't be a real change. It would be extending my father's influence through a proxy. Nathan arrived as we were finishing dessert, declining pie but accepting a scotch. As he settled into his chair, our father brought him up to speed. We've decided to bring Jack Forrester in as CEO. Nathan's eyes flicked to me, then back to our father. We have? Your sister thinks we should waste time interviewing strangers, but I think we need someone who understands the Pierce way of doing things. Interesting. Nathan sipped his scotch. What did the board say? I haven't discussed it with them yet, our father replied. But they'll see the sense in it. Don't you think Vanessa's plan should be followed as presented? Nathan asked, surprising me with his directness. It's working so far. Our father's gaze hardened. Parts of her plan are working. That doesn't mean every recommendation is gospel. But the leadership change was central to— I'm not having this discussion again, our father interrupted. The decision is made. The tension around the table was palpable. My mother busied herself collecting dessert plates, though she hadn't finished her own pie. Nathan stared into his scotch, and I felt something inside me, something that had been bending and stretching for years, finally began to snap. No, I said quietly. My father blinked. Excuse me? No, I repeated, louder this time. The decision isn't made, not unilaterally by you. This is exactly the problem with how Pierce Manufacturing has been run. One person making critical decisions, without proper consideration of alternatives or consequences. Vanessa, my mother murmured, a note of warning in her voice. But I was beyond warnings now. You asked for my help. You're getting it. All of it, including my professional judgment about what's needed. If you just wanted a rubber stamp for decisions you'd already made, you should have called someone else. My father's face had gone very still, the dangerous stillness I remembered from childhood confrontations. I think you're forgetting who built this company from nothing. Who made it possible for you to have the privileged life you've enjoyed? Who paid for that fancy education that makes you think you know better than everyone else? I paid for my education, I corrected him. Every penny of it. And I've never forgotten what you built. But what you built is now at risk of collapse because you and Nathan— I caught myself, shook my head. Because decisions were made that ignored financial realities. I'm trying to prevent those same patterns from continuing. By bringing in some outsider who knows nothing about our history, our values. By bringing in someone qualified who isn't emotionally invested in preserving the status quo. We stared at each other across the table, the battle lines clearly drawn. Then my father did something unexpected. He laughed, a short, harsh sound entirely devoid of humor. You haven't changed a bit, have you? He said, shaking his head. Still the same stubborn little girl who thought she knew everything. And suddenly, I was 12 years old again, sitting at this same table, being dismissed and diminished. I could feel the familiar tightness in my chest, the burning behind my eyes that I refused to let become tears. You know what, Dad? You're right. I haven't changed. I've always seen things clearly, including you, and you've always hated that about me. I stood, tossing my napkin onto the table. I'll have my full recommendation to the board on Monday, including a short list of CEO candidates with proper turnaround experience. If you want to push for Jack Forrester against my professional advice, that's your prerogative. But I won't endorse. My mother reached for my arm. Vanessa, please. It's fine, Mom. I gently disengaged from her grasp. This is a business disagreement, that's all. But it wasn't, and we all knew it. It was the culmination of decades of being sidelined, underestimated, and taken for granted. Of watching my father make the same mistakes over and over, refusing to learn or adapt. Of being called in to clean up messes I hadn't created, only to be criticized for my methods. As I gathered my things to leave, Nathan followed me to the foyer. That went well, he said dryly. Despite everything, I smiled. About as expected. He'll come around. He has to. The numbers don't lie. Numbers have never stopped him before. I shrugged into my coat. But the board and the bank might. Nathan hesitated, then said, I'll talk to him. Try to make him see reason. Good luck with that. I mean it, Van. What you're doing for the company, it matters. I know he doesn't show it, but don't. I held up a hand. Don't make excuses for him. Not anymore. He nodded slowly. Fair enough. As I drove back to my hotel that night, my mind returned to something that had happened long ago. A memory I'd buried but never truly forgotten. I was 16, a junior in high school. I'd been selected as one of 2 students to represent Oregon at a national economics competition for high schoolers in Washington, D.C. It was a prestigious opportunity, one that would look excellent on college applications, certainly, but more than that, it was validation. Recognition of my abilities in a field I was growing to love. The competition fell on the same weekend as a major client dinner my father was hosting. Attendance was mandatory for the entire family, one of his unbreakable rules. When I told him about the competition, explaining why it mattered and what it could mean for my future, he listened with what seemed like genuine interest. That sounds like quite an honor, he'd said, nodding thoughtfully. When is it again? I'd told him the dates, heart sinking as I watched his expression change, hardening into something immovable. You know that's the Weston dinner weekend. I know, but Dad, this is really important. It's a national competition. Only 2 students from the whole state. The Weston contract is worth $7 million to this company, to this family. That dinner isn't optional, Vanessa. But I've been preparing for months. My economics teacher thinks I could win. There will be other competitions. His tone made it clear the discussion was over. Family obligations come first. Always. I'd gone to my mother afterward, hoping she might intercede. She'd sympathized, even cried a little, but ultimately backed my father. He's under so much pressure with this contract, sweetheart. We need to support him right now. That night, locked in my bedroom, I'd made 2 decisions. First, that I would find a way to compete despite my father's edict. And second, that I would build a life where no one, not even family, could dictate my choices or diminish my achievements. I forged my father's signature on the permission slip. I told my parents I was staying with a friend to study for finals the weekend of the competition. I took a bus to Portland, then a plane to D.C. I competed, and I won 2nd place nationally. The medal and certificate were mailed to my school, where my economics teacher, Mr. Jameson, kept them for me, understanding without being told why they couldn't come to my home. When I returned, glowing with secret triumph, I found the Westin. Dinner had gone poorly. The client had taken their business elsewhere. My father was in a black mood that lasted for weeks, and I never told anyone in my family what I'd achieved. It seemed safer that way. Now, 15 years later, I realized that weekend had shaped me more than I'd acknowledged. It had taught me that my father's priorities would always be the company first, family second, and within the family hierarchy, my goals and dreams would always rank last. It had taught me that achievement in silence was safer than risking disapproval. Most of all, it had taught me that if I wanted a life of my own, I would have to build it for myself, against resistance, in the spaces my father couldn't control. I had done exactly that. I'd built a career, a reputation, a life in San Francisco. That was entirely my own. And now, ironically, that success had drawn me back into my father's orbit, back to the company I'd distanced myself from, back to the patterns I'd escaped. The question now was whether I could help save Pierce Manufacturing without losing myself in the process. As I pulled into the hotel parking lot, my phone buzzed with a text from Nathan. Dad's calmed down. Says he'll consider a proper CEO search if you present compelling alternatives to Jack. Progress? I stared at the message for a long moment before responding. It's something. We'll see what Monday brings. But even as I typed the words, I had the unsettling feeling that this temporary truce was just that. Temporary. The real battle was still ahead. and I wasn't at all sure what winning would look like or what it might cost. Monday morning arrived with a clarity I hadn't felt in days. I woke before my alarm, dressed with purpose, and arrived at Pierce Manufacturing before most of the staff. The quiet of the early morning gave me time to finalize my CEO candidate shortlist and complete the restructuring proposal I would present to the board later that day. By 7:30, Alex and Melissa had joined me, bringing coffee and determined energy. "How was the family dinner?" Alex asked, arranging financial projections in precise stacks. "About what you'd expect," I replied. "My father wants to install his golf buddy as CEO." Melissa winced. "Classic move. Keep the illusion of change while maintaining control." "Exactly. Which is why our presentation today needs to be airtight." I tapped the folder containing profiles of 3 potential CEO candidates, none of whom were Jack Forrester. We need the board fully behind us. The morning passed in a flurry of last-minute preparations. At 10, Nathan stopped by, looking uncharacteristically rumpled. "Dad's been making calls all morning," he said without preamble. "To board members, to Jack, to key customers." I felt a flicker of irritation but wasn't surprised. Of course he has. He's presenting Jack as a done deal. Nathan perched on the edge of the conference table. "Several board members have already called to congratulate me on the solution." "It's not a solution if it doesn't solve the underlying problems," I said, continuing to arrange my presentation materials. "And it's certainly not a done deal." Nathan studied me, something like admiration in his expression. "You're really going to go up against him, aren't you? In front of the whole board." "It's not about going against Dad. It's about doing what's right for the company." "Those two things have always been mutually exclusive," he said with a wry smile. "You're just the first one brave enough to say it out loud." The board meeting was scheduled for 11. I arrived early to set up, noting the seating arrangement had been changed since Friday, my father now positioned at the head of the table rather than among the other board members, a subtle reassertion of his authority. Board members filtered in their greetings to me noticeably cooler than they had been after Friday's meeting. My father arrived last, Jack Forrester at his side, a calculated move that wasn't lost on me. Jack was in his early 60s, silver-haired and country club polished. He shook my hand with practiced warmth. "Vanessa, it's been years. Ted tells me you've been doing remarkable work with the restructuring." "We're making progress," I said neutrally. "I wasn't aware you'd be joining us today. Your father thought it would be helpful for me to get up to speed quickly." His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Given the circumstances. Before I could respond, my father called the meeting to order. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. As you know, we've been working through a significant financial restructuring. Vanessa has some updates for us, and then I'd like to discuss the leadership transition plan." It was a clear attempt to control the narrative, positioning. The CEO decision is already made, with my role merely to provide updates on other matters. But I hadn't come this far to be sidelined. "Thank you, Dad," I said, taking my place at the front of the room. "Before I get to the operational updates, I'd like to address the leadership question directly, as it's central to our restructuring strategy." My father's expression tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "As I outlined in our previous meeting, Pierce Manufacturing needs substantial changes to survive and eventually thrive again. Those changes must start at the top." I distributed folders to each board member. Inside, you'll find detailed profiles of 3 candidates for the CEO position, each with proven success in manufacturing turnarounds similar to our situation. Jack Forrester shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Several board members exchanged glances. The first candidate, Diane Mercer, led Apex Industries through a successful debt restructuring and returned to profitability in just 14 months. The second, Michael Zhang, specializes in modernizing traditional manufacturing operations and has particular expertise in the kinds of automation upgrades Pierce needs to remain competitive. The third, James Whitaker, successfully transitioned Marshall equipment from family to professional management while preserving its core values and culture. I paused, making eye contact with each board member. All three candidates have expressed interest in the position, contingent on our commitment to the full restructuring plan. All three have stronger relevant experience than Mr. Forrester, whose last turnaround was nearly a decade ago in a very different market environment. The room went silent. My father's face had gone rigid. This isn't personal, I continued. It's about bringing in the right expertise for our specific challenges. Mr. Forrester has had a distinguished career, but we need specialized experience that aligns precisely with our current situation. Janet Fletcher, who had been studying the candidate profiles, looked up. These are impressive candidates, Vanessa. Have you spoken with them directly? Yes. I've had preliminary conversations with each to confirm their interest and availability. Without board authorization, my father interjected, finding his voice. Without discussing it with current leadership. As the board approved restructuring, consultant, identifying potential leadership candidates falls within my scope, I replied evenly. I've merely done the preliminary work so the board can make an informed decision. Another board member, Richard Lawson, who had always been aligned with my father, cleared his throat. While these candidates look good on paper, Jack has decades of experience in our industry. He knows our customers, our suppliers, our way of doing business. With respect, I countered, our way of doing business is precisely what has led to our current situation. We need fresh perspectives and specific turnaround expertise. My father stood abruptly. I think we need to take a step back here. When we discussed bringing in a new CEO, the understanding was that it would be someone who would work closely with existing leadership during a transition period. Someone who understands the Pierce manufacturing culture and values. The understanding, I said carefully, was that we would find the most qualified person to lead the company through this difficult period. Culture can be learned, values can be maintained. But turnaround expertise is specialized and crucial right now. The tension in the room was palpable. Board members glanced between us, clearly uncomfortable with the open conflict. Janet Fletcher broke the silence. I'd like to hear more about these candidates. Perhaps we should schedule interviews with all of them, including Jack, and make a decision based on those conversations. It was a reasonable compromise, and one I had anticipated. That seems sensible. I can arrange interviews for next week. My father looked like he wanted to object, but seemed to realize he was potentially outnumbered. Fine. Interviews next week. But I want to be clear that management will have significant input in this decision. This company was built on certain principles, and those won't be sacrificed for the sake of expediency. The meeting continued with updates on the debt restructuring and cost-cutting measures already implemented. Throughout, I could feel my father's gaze on me. Not angry now, but calculating. I had won this round, but the battle was far from over. After the meeting adjourned, board members filed out quickly, eager to escape the tension. Jack Forrester departed with a stiff nod in my direction, clearly having expected a very different outcome to the meeting. My father remained seated, waiting until we were alone before speaking. You ambushed me. I presented the best options for the company's survival. That's my job. Your job, he said, emphasizing each word, is to help this company, not take it over. I'm not taking anything over. I'm ensuring the board has qualified candidates to consider. He studied me for a long moment. You know, I've spent the last 15 years telling people how brilliantly my daughter was doing in San Francisco. How proud I was of what you'd built on your own. I thought when you came back, it would be to help strengthen what I built, not dismantle it. The mention of pride caught me off guard. Had he really been proud? Had he really spoken of my achievements to others when he'd barely acknowledged them to me? I'm not dismantling anything, I said, softer now. I'm trying to save it. But saving something doesn't always mean keeping it exactly the same. He stood, gathering his papers. We'll see what the board decides after the interviews. But remember what I said, Vanessa. This is still a family company. When all this is over, we'll still have to live with each other. It sounded almost like a warning. As he left, I sat alone in the conference room, turning his words over in my mind. My father wasn't used to being challenged, certainly not by me. For 32 years, I had alternated between seeking his approval and maintaining a safe distance. Now, I was directly opposing him in the arena he valued most, his company. Whatever fragile relationship we had was being tested in ways it never had before. The question was whether it would survive. The week that followed was among the most intense of my professional life. By day, I continued implementing the restructuring plan, negotiating with creditors, identifying inefficiencies, meeting with key customers to reassure them about the company's future. By night, I prepared for the CEO candidate interviews, gathering data, refining questions, anticipating my father's counterarguments. Nathan continued to surprise me with his support, running interference with our father when possible and providing insights into the company's operations that proved invaluable. Whatever resentment he might have felt about my role in the restructuring seemed to have given way to a pragmatic acceptance that changes were necessary. My father maintained a cool professionalism when we had to interact, but there was an undercurrent of tension that everyone in the company could feel. The battle lines had been drawn, and employees had begun taking sides, most of the old guard aligning with my father, while younger staff and those in financial roles tended to support my approach. It was during this fraught week that I received an unexpected call from David Chen, my boss at Maxwell Financial Advisors. "Vanessa," he said when I answered, "how's the family business rescue going?" "About as smoothly as performing surgery on your own parent," I replied, grateful to speak with someone who understood the complexities of my situation. He chuckled. "That's bad, huh? Listen, I won't take much of your time. I'm calling about the Westerfield account." Westerfield Technologies was one of my biggest clients in San Francisco, a tech manufacturing company that I'd been advising on expansion strategies for the past 2 years. "What about them?" I asked, instantly alert. "Is there a problem?" "Not exactly. They're preparing for their next phase of manufacturing expansion, and they specifically requested you to lead the advisory team. I told them you were on family leave, but they're insistent. Marcus Westerfield says no one understands their growth strategy like you do." I felt a complicated mix of pride and anxiety. The Westerfield expansion was a major opportunity, the kind of high-profile project that could elevate my career to the next level. Under normal circumstances, I would have jumped at it. "When would they need me?" I asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't be convenient. "That's the thing. Planning starts next week. Board presentation the week after. They've got capital lined up, but they need the strategic framework finalized ASAP." I glanced at the calendar on my laptop, where CEO candidate interviews were scheduled throughout the following week, with critical vendor negotiations the week after. "That's not ideal timing, David," he sighed. "I know. And normally I wouldn't push. But this is Westerfield. $20 million in potential fees over the next 3 years. If we lose them..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. In the consulting world, clients like Westerfield were gold. "Let me see what I can do," I said finally. "Maybe I can split my time, handle some of the Westerfield work remotely." "I appreciate that. And Vanessa? The partners are noticing your absence. Phillips asked again yesterday when you'd be back. I've been running interference, but..." The unspoken message was clear. My extended absence was becoming a liability. The firm had been generous in granting me family leave, but their patience wasn't infinite. "I understand. I'll figure something out." After we hung up, I sat at my makeshift desk in Pierce Manufacturing, feeling pulled in opposing directions. The rational choice was obvious. My career was in San Francisco. Maxwell Financial was my future. The Westerfield account was a golden opportunity. Pierce Manufacturing was a temporary problem I was helping solve, not my long-term responsibility. And yet, the restructuring wasn't complete. The leadership transition was at a critical juncture. If I left now, my father would almost certainly push through Jack Forrester's appointment, undoing much of the progress we'd made. The company might survive, in the short term, but the fundamental problems would remain unaddressed. More than that, there was a part of me, a part I hadn't fully acknowledged, that wanted to see this through. To prove, perhaps to my father, perhaps to myself, that I could save the company that had never been meant for me, that my vision for its future was viable, that I deserved a voice in the family legacy, even if I'd built my own path. I was still contemplating this dilemma when my mother stopped by the office unexpectedly that afternoon, carrying a small wicker basket. "I thought you might be forgetting." "To eat," she said, setting the basket on my desk. Inside were sandwiches, fruit, and homemade cookies, a care package reminiscent of those she'd sent during my college finals weeks. "Thanks, Mom. This is really thoughtful." She smiled, settling into the chair across from me. "How are you holding up?" "Really?" I considered deflecting with a standard fine, but the genuine concern in her eyes made me reconsider. "Honestly, I'm exhausted, torn, frustrated, and..." I hesitated. Confused, I guess. About what to do next. I nodded. "I just got a call from my firm in San Francisco. A major client is requesting me specifically for a project starting next week. If I don't go back, I could lose the client. Maybe jeopardize my position." My mother was quiet for a moment, absently straightening items on my desk, a habit from decades of creating order in our home. "What does your heart tell you?" It was such a mom question that I almost smiled. My heart doesn't get much say in business decisions, doesn't it? She looked at me thoughtfully. "You could have said no when your father called. You could have recommended someone else to handle the restructuring. But you came. That wasn't just business." She had a point. For all my protestations about professional obligation and family duty, something deeper had brought me back to Portland. "I don't know what the right choice is," I admitted. "If I leave now, much of what I've started here might unravel. If I stay longer, I might damage my own career." "The eternal balance," my mother said softly. "Family versus self. I know something about that choice." There was a weight to her words that caught my attention. My mother had rarely spoken about her own sacrifices, her own desires subsumed by my father's ambitions and the demands of family life. "Do you regret your choices?" I asked, suddenly needing to know. She considered this, her gaze drifting to the chart. "Regret is too simple a word. I made choices that felt necessary at the time. Some brought joy, others brought compromise." She looked back at me. "But I made them. They weren't made for me. That's the difference, Vanessa. Whatever you decide, make sure it's your choice. Not your father's, not the firm's, not even mine." It was perhaps the most direct advice she had ever given me, all the more powerful for its rarity. "Dad won't make it easy," I said. "If I push through with my plan for the company, replace him with one of my candidates, the relationship might never recover." "Probably not," she agreed, surprising me with her candor. "But it's already changed, hasn't it?" The moment you stood up in that boardroom and challenged him, something fundamental shifted. There's no going back to the way things were. She was right. The careful détente that had characterized our relationship for years, my independence traded for his indifference, had been shattered the moment I returned to Portland. Whatever came next would be entirely new territory. "For what it's worth," my mother continued, "I think what you're doing here is right, necessary. The company needs the changes you're implementing. Your father needs them too, though he'll never admit it. She reached across the desk to squeeze my hand. And whatever you decide about staying or going, I'm proud of you. Not just for your success, but for your courage. Coming from my typically reserved mother, the words were like water in a desert. I hadn't realized how much I'd needed to hear them until that moment. After she left, I turned back to my work with renewed focus. The path forward wasn't clear yet, but one thing was certain. Whatever choice I made would be mine. Not a reaction against my father, not a capitulation to him, but a decision based on what I truly wanted. The irony wasn't lost on me. In trying to save my father's company, I was finally learning to fully step out from his shadow. The CEO candidate interviews were scheduled for Monday through Wednesday of the following week. I spent the weekend preparing, reviewing resumes, and crafting questions specifically tailored to Pierce Manufacturing's unique challenges. I also set up video conferences with my team in San Francisco, trying to keep the Westerfield project moving forward remotely. It was a precarious balancing act, one that left little time for sleep or personal considerations. But I was determined to give both responsibilities my best effort, at least until a clearer path forward emerged. Monday morning began with Diane Mercer, the first CEO candidate. She arrived at Pierce Manufacturing promptly at 9, dressed in a tailored navy suit that projected confidence without ostentation. The interview committee consisted of myself, Nathan, 3 board members, including Janet Fletcher, and my father, who had insisted on being present despite my concerns about his objectivity. Diane's interview was impressive by any standard. She demonstrated a clear understanding of Pierce's challenges based on the materials I'd sent in advance, asked insightful questions about the company's history and culture, and outlined a specific vision for how she would approach the turnaround. Most importantly, she showed no deference to my father simply because of his founder status. She treated him as one stakeholder among many, which I appreciated but knew would irritate him. "Ms. Mercer," my father said toward the end of the interview, his tone deceptively casual. "Pierce Manufacturing has been a family business for nearly 40 years. How would you handle the transition from family to professional management? Particularly, with family members remaining involved in the company?" It was a loaded question, and we all knew it. I watched Diane carefully as she considered her response. "In my experience, Mr. Pierce," she said finally, "successful transitions require clear boundaries and roles. If I were CEO, I would expect full operational authority while respecting the board's strategic oversight. Family members continuing with the company would need to understand and accept that shift in decision-making. Without that clarity, the transition would likely fail." My father's expression remained neutral, but I could see the tightening around his eyes that signaled displeasure. "And what about company culture? The values that have guided Pierce for decades?" "Culture evolves with leadership," Diane replied. "My approach would be to identify which aspects of Pierce's culture are essential to preserve, which have become liabilities, and which need to evolve for the company to thrive in today's market. I wouldn't dismantle what works, but I also wouldn't maintain traditions simply because they've always been done that way." It was exactly the answer I would have hoped for, but I knew it wasn't what my father wanted to hear. He wanted reassurance that Pierce Manufacturing would remain essentially unchanged except for its financial performance, that his vision and approach would continue to guide the company even with a new name on the office door. After Diane left, the committee took a short break before Michael Jang's interview. I was checking emails in the conference room when Nathan slipped into the seat beside me. "She's good," he said quietly. I nodded. "Very. Exactly what the company needs right now." Dad hated her. I couldn't help but smile at his bluntness. I noticed. "He's not going to make this easy, Van. He's already working the board members individually, pushing for Jack." I expected that. I closed my laptop with a sigh. "How about you? What did you think of her?" Nathan considered this. I think she'd make a lot of changes I should have made years ago but didn't have the courage to. Probably fire about a third of the executive team. Restructure operations completely. He paused. And I think she'd probably be right to do it. His self-awareness surprised me. That's remarkably objective. He shrugged. I've had a front-row seat to our decline for years. I'm not blind to my own failings as a leader. He glanced toward the door, ensuring we were still alone. But here's what you need to know. Jack Forrester is having dinner at the house tonight. Private strategy session with Dad. Of course he is, I muttered. They're solidifying their approach before his interview tomorrow. Exactly. And Jack's? Calling in favors with board members. He's got connections with most of them through various civic organizations, country club memberships, you name it. So they're working the system from all angles. Nathan nodded grimly. Just wanted you to be prepared. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. David Chen again. I sent it to voicemail, knowing whatever he had to say about Westerfield would only complicate my current situation further. The rest of the day proceeded with Michael Zhang's interview in the morning and preparation for James Whitaker the following day. Zhang was technically brilliant, but lacked some of Diane's interpersonal finesse, a quality that would matter in managing the transition from family to professional leadership. Still, his expertise in modernizing manufacturing operations would be invaluable to a company like Pierce that had fallen behind the technology curve. By the time I returned to my hotel that evening, I had 17 missed calls. 8 from David, 5 from Marcus Westerfield himself, 3 from other partners at Maxwell Financial, and 1 from my assistant in San Francisco. The voicemails grew progressively more urgent, making it clear that my attempt to balance both responsibilities was failing. I was about to return David's call when my phone rang again, this time with Nathan's number. What's wrong? I answered, hearing background noise that suggested he wasn't at home. Emergency board meeting, he said without preamble. Dad's called it for tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. I sat up straight. What? We have Whitaker's interview at 10. Exactly. He's trying to force a vote on the CEO position before all the candidates have been interviewed. Janet Fletcher just called to warn me. He can't do that, I protested. The board agreed to complete all interviews before making a decision. Technically, there was no formal vote on the process, Nathan reminded me. And as chairman, he has the authority to call emergency meetings at his discretion. I closed my eyes, feeling a headache forming behind my temples. Let me guess. Jack Forrester will be present, along with a full proposal for his first 90 days as CEO, already approved by Dad. It was a power play, pure and simple. By scheduling the meeting before Whitaker's interview, my father was attempting to cut off the process before it could be completed, leveraging his relationships with the board to push through his preferred candidate. This is exactly why the company is in trouble, I said, frustration evident in my voice. Backdoor deals, circumventing proper processes, making decisions based on relationships rather than business reality. I know. Nathan sounded equally frustrated. I've spent the last hour calling board members, trying to convince them to at least delay the vote until after all interviews are complete. Janet's doing the same. We might have enough support to prevent an immediate decision, but it's going to be close. I'll be there at 6:30, I promised. And Nathan? Thank you for the warning and for standing up to Dad on this. There was a brief pause before he responded. It's time someone did. After we hung up, I finally returned David's call, bracing myself for the conversation to come. Vanessa, finally, he answered, not bothering to hide his irritation. We've been trying to reach you all day. I know, I'm sorry. I was in CEO candidate interviews all day. What's happening with Westerfield? David's sigh carried clearly across the connection. What's happening is they're threatening to take their business elsewhere. Marcus called an emergency meeting this morning to discuss the expansion strategy. When I explained you weren't available, he trailed off. How bad is it? Bad. They've given us an ultimatum. Either you're on a plane to San Francisco tomorrow for their Wednesday board meeting, or they're considering other firms. The timing couldn't have been worse. Wednesday was the final day of CEO interviews, with board deliberations scheduled for Thursday. David, I can't leave Portland right now. We're in the middle of a critical leadership transition that could determine whether Pierce Manufacturing survives. I understand that's important to your family, Vanessa, but Maxwell Financial is your career. The partners are meeting tomorrow to discuss the situation. Phillips used the phrase, divided loyalties. It was a warning shot. In the competitive world of financial consulting, firms expected unwavering commitment from their top performers. Extended leaves for family matters were tolerated, but only up to a point. I was reaching that point. What are you saying exactly? David's voice softened slightly. I'm saying choices have consequences. You've built an exceptional reputation here. Clients like Westerfield want you specifically because of your expertise and track record. But if you're not available when they need you, someone else will be. I finished for him. Exactly. And the firm will need to support whoever takes over those relationships. He paused. Look, I value you, both as a colleague and a friend. I've been running interference for you as long as I can. But decisions need to be made, Vanessa. By you and potentially by the firm. After hanging up, I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, the weight of competing obligations pressing down on me. In San Francisco, my career, the one I'd built independently, on my own terms, was in jeopardy. In Portland, the restructuring I'd initiated was at risk of being undermined by my father's machinations. I had reached the moment of decision I'd been avoiding since returning to Portland. I could not serve both masters indefinitely. Something had to give. I spent hours that night preparing for the emergency board meeting, gathering evidence to support completing the interview process, documenting the concerns about Jack Forrester's qualifications compared to the other candidates. At 2 a.m., I finally fell into a restless sleep, only to wake 3 hours later to continue preparing. When I arrived at Pierce Manufacturing at 6:30 the next morning, Nathan was already there, pacing the hallway outside the boardroom. He's been here since 5, he told me, gesturing toward our father's office where lights were visible beneath the closed door. Meeting privately with board members as they arrive. Of course he is, I muttered, setting down my briefcase. How's it looking? 4 solid votes against making a decision today. You, me, Janet, and Roy Cameron. 3 definite votes with Dad, Richard Lawson, Bill Matthews, and Peter Klein. The other 3 could go either way. It would come down to persuasion, my father's long-standing relationships against my financial expertise and evidence-based approach. By 7 a.m., all board members had assembled. Jack Forrester sat in the corner, a bound presentation on his lap, looking every inch the CEO in waiting. My father called the meeting to order with a gravity that suggested momentous decisions were at hand. Thank you all for accommodating this early meeting, he began. Given the urgency of our situation and the clear standout among our CEO candidates, I believe we're in a position to make a decision today and begin the transition process immediately. Janet Fletcher frowned. Ted, we agreed to interview all candidates before making any decisions. James Whitaker is scheduled for 10 o'clock. With respect, Janet, we never formally voted on that process, my father replied smoothly. And having seen the first 2 candidates yesterday, I think it's clear that we have an obvious choice in Jack Forrester, someone who understands our business, our culture, and has the experience to guide us through this difficult period. He gestured for Jack to distribute his presentation, a slick, professionally bound document titled Pierce Manufacturing: The Path Forward. Jack has already prepared a comprehensive transition plan, my father continued. He's ready to start immediately, which, given our financial situation, is a significant advantage. I leafed through the document quickly, noting that it was remarkably light on financial specifics but heavy on preserving Pierce values and organizational continuity. It proposed only modest changes to the executive team, keeping most of my father's longtime allies in place, and suggested a gradual approach to operational restructuring. In other words, it was a plan designed to change as little as possible while giving the appearance of transformation. "I'd like to raise a point of order," I said, keeping my voice calm and professional despite my growing frustration. As the board-appointed restructuring consultant, I must emphasize that making a CEO decision before completing the interview process would be both procedurally irregular and potentially detrimental to the company. "Vanessa," my father said, an edge of warning in his voice, "we appreciate your input, but the board is capable of determining its own process. The board should also be aware," I continued, ignoring his attempted shutdown, "that our primary creditor, First National Bank, has indicated that their continued support is contingent on seeing significant leadership changes. Based on my conversations with them, they would view the appointment of a longtime associate of current management as insufficient evidence of meaningful change." This wasn't strictly true. I hadn't discussed specific candidates with the bank, but it was a strategic exaggeration based on their general feedback about the need for fresh leadership. A murmur ran through the board members. The bank's continued support was essential to Pierce's survival, and everyone knew it. "Furthermore," I added, pushing my advantage, "I've reviewed Mr. Forrester's preliminary plan, and while it contains some valuable elements, it lacks the comprehensive financial restructuring measures our situation demands. The other candidates have proposed more substantial changes that would address our underlying problems, not just the symptoms." My father's expression hardened. "Vanessa, you're overstepping. This meeting was called to consider Jack's candidacy, not to relitigate the entire restructuring approach." "Actually, Ted," Janet interjected, "I think Vanessa's points are relevant. We have a fiduciary duty to consider all qualified candidates and make a decision based on what's best for the company's long-term health, not expediency." The discussion devolved into increasingly tense debate. Board members questioned Jack directly about his experience with turnarounds, his specific plans for Pierce, and his relationship with my father. Some seemed satisfied with his responses, others grew more skeptical. Throughout, my father maintained his position that an immediate decision was necessary, while I argued for completing the interview process. After nearly 2 hours of contentious discussion, Janet proposed a compromise. "I move that we postpone any decision until after James Whitaker's interview, but schedule a vote for tomorrow morning rather than Thursday as originally planned. That gives us all time to consider the candidates properly without undue delay." The motion passed 6-4, with my father and his closest allies opposed. It wasn't a complete victory, but it prevented the railroading I had feared. As the meeting adjourned, my father swept out without speaking to me, his displeasure evident in the stiff set of his shoulders. Jack Forrester approached me as I gathered my papers. "You're quite the adversary, Vanessa," he said, his tone friendly enough though his eyes were cold. "Your father warned me you might make this difficult." "It's not about making things difficult, Mr. Forrester. It's about doing what's right for the company." "And you believe that's bringing in an outside CEO who doesn't understand Pierce's history or values?" "I believe it's bringing in the best qualified person for the job," I corrected him. "If you're that person, you'll have my full support. But the process needs to be fair and thorough." He smiled thinly. "Your father built something remarkable here. It would be a shame to see it transformed into just another soulless corporation in the name of financial efficiency." It was a talking point straight from my father's playbook, positioning any change as a threat to the company's soul, rather than necessary evolution. "What would be a shame," I replied evenly, "is watching Pierce Manufacturing collapse because we couldn't adapt to market realities. 253 employees depend on this company. They care less about its soul than their continued employment." Before he could respond, my phone rang. Marcus Westerfield's number displaying on the screen. I excused myself to take the call, knowing it would likely determine my future in San Francisco. Marcus, I answered, stepping into an empty office. I'm sorry I haven't been able to get back to you sooner. Vanessa. His voice was clipped, disappointed. David tells me you won't be at tomorrow's board meeting. I'm dealing with a family emergency that requires my presence in Portland. I've reviewed the expansion framework remotely and provided detailed feedback to the team. They're fully prepared to present a solid strategy tomorrow. That's not good enough, he said bluntly. We specifically requested you for this project. Your insights were central to our decision to work with Maxwell Financial. I understand, and I'm committed to your project. I'm simply asking for flexibility on the timing of my physical presence. There was a pause, then, I'm sorry, Vanessa, but we need someone who can be fully present during this critical phase. If that's not you right now, we'll need to explore other options. The implication was clear. Either I returned to San Francisco immediately, or Westerfield would take their business elsewhere, likely ending my career at Maxwell Financial in the process. As I stood in that empty office, caught between competing obligations and impossible choices, I felt a strange sense of clarity emerging from the chaos. For years, I had built my identity around my independence from my father and his company. My career in San Francisco represented freedom from his influence, validation that I could succeed on my own terms. But in the past 2 weeks, something had shifted. I had seen Pierce Manufacturing not just as my father's company, but as a living entity that provided livelihoods for hundreds of people. I had begun to care about its future in a way I hadn't anticipated, and while part of that care stemmed from a desire to prove myself to my father, another part, perhaps the larger part, came from a genuine belief that I could help turn things around. The question now was what that realization was worth. Was I willing to risk the career I'd built to see this through? To potentially burn bridges in San Francisco for a family company that had never truly been mine? As James Whitaker's interview approached and Marcus Westerfield awaited my decision, I knew I had reached a crossroads that would determine not just my professional future, but my relationship with my father and my own identity going forward. Whatever choice I made, there would be no going back. I stood in the empty office at Pierce Manufacturing, Marcus Westerfield's ultimatum hanging in the air between us. The moment demanded an immediate answer, but I found myself asking for what I rarely requested in business: more time. Marcus, I need 24 hours, I said, surprising both of us with my directness. This situation requires one final day to resolve. By this time tomorrow, I'll give you a definitive answer about my availability going forward. His sigh carried through the phone, heavy with disappointment. Vanessa, we've already been more than patient. I understand that, and I appreciate it. One more day won't materially impact your timeline, but it will allow me to make the right decision for both of us. I don't want to make promises I can't keep. After a lengthy pause, he relented. 24 hours. But that's it, Vanessa. After that, we need to move forward, with or without you. I understand. Thank you. After hanging up, I leaned against the desk, the weight of competing obligations pressing down on me. 24 hours to decide between the career I'd built and the family business I'd returned to save. 24 hours to determine whether I would walk away from Pierce Manufacturing mid-rescue or potentially sacrifice my position at Maxwell Financial. There was no time to dwell on the dilemma. James. Whitaker's interview was scheduled to begin in 30 minutes, and I needed to be focused and prepared. I pushed my personal concerns aside, gathered my materials, and headed back to the conference room. James Whitaker proved to be as impressive in person as he was on paper. Articulate, thoughtful, with a clear understanding of the challenges facing family businesses in transition. His previous experience had remarkable parallels to Pierce's situation, having guided a third-generation manufacturing company through professionalization of management while preserving its core values. Most notably, he demonstrated a diplomatic approach to managing the founder during transition, acknowledging the emotional investment while gently establishing necessary boundaries. It was exactly the balanced approach Pierce needed, and I could see that even some of my father's allies on the board were impressed. "Mr. Whitaker," my father asked during the questioning, using the same tactic he had with Diane Mercer, "how would you handle resistance from long-term employees who are accustomed to a certain way of doing things?" James considered this thoughtfully. "Change is difficult for everyone, Mr. Pierce. I've found that the key is distinguishing between values and practices. Core values, integrity, quality, customer focus, should be preserved and celebrated. But specific practices may need to evolve if they're no longer serving the business effectively." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze direct. "In my experience, most resistance comes from fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of failure, fear of losing status or purpose. Addressing those fears directly, involving long-term employees in the change process, and being transparent about the why behind changes can transform resistors into advocates." It was a masterful answer, respectful of the company's history, while firmly committed to necessary evolution. I glanced at Janet Fletcher, who gave me the slightest nod of approval. Even Nathan looked impressed. My father's expression remained neutral, but I could see the slight tension in his jaw that indicated he hadn't found the vulnerability he was looking for. After Whitaker left, the board took a brief lunch break before reconvening to discuss all three candidates. The conversation was surprisingly balanced, with board members thoughtfully weighing the strengths and weaknesses of each option. Janet Fletcher spoke strongly in favor of Diane Mercer, citing her impressive financial turnaround experience. Roy Cameron preferred James Whitaker, appreciating his experience with family business transitions. My father, predictably, advocated for Jack Forrester, emphasizing his industry knowledge and understanding of the Pierce way. Richard Lawson and Bill Matthews backed him, though with less conviction than I had expected. Throughout the discussion, I presented objective data on each candidate's qualifications and relevant experience, careful to maintain professional neutrality, despite my clear preference for either Mercer or Whitaker over Forrester. By late afternoon, it was evident that the board was genuinely divided, with no candidate holding a clear majority. Janet proposed that each board member take the evening to review all materials and reconvene for a vote the following morning at 9 a.m. With no objections, the meeting adjourned. As board members filtered out, my father approached me, his expression unreadable. "My office," he said quietly. I followed him down the hallway, steeling myself for the confrontation to come. He closed the door behind us, then moved to stand behind his desk, a position of authority he had occupied for decades. "You've put me in an impossible position, Vanessa," he began, his voice controlled but tight with frustration. "Undermined my recommendation to my own board. Pushed for candidates who would dismantle everything I've built." "That's not true, Dad. Both Mercer and Whitaker explicitly discussed preserving Pierce's core values while making necessary changes. Changes that are essential if this company is going to survive. Jack Forrester knows this industry inside and out. He knows our customers, our suppliers. Jack Forrester," I interrupted, "would maintain the status quo while making superficial changes to appease the bank. That's not what Pierce needs right now." My father's hands clenched briefly on the desk. "You've been gone for over a decade, Vanessa. You swoop in for a few weeks and suddenly you're the expert on what Pierce Manufacturing needs? I'm an expert on financial restructuring. That's why you called me in the first place." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice level. "Dad, I understand this is difficult. You built something remarkable here, but holding on to control too tightly might be the very thing that destroys it." He shook his head, a bitter smile playing at his lips. "You always did think you knew better than everyone else, even as a child, always questioning, always challenging. Is that such a bad quality in a business person? It is when it becomes stubbornness for its own sake. He sat heavily in his chair, suddenly looking older than his 68 years. This company is my legacy, Vanessa. Everything I've worked for, everything I've sacrificed. And you want to hand it over to strangers who don't understand what it means. There was genuine pain in his voice, something I rarely heard from Theodore Pierce. For the first time, I glimpsed the fear behind his anger. Not just fear of losing control, but fear of erasure, of irrelevance, of watching his life's work transform into something he no longer recognized. "It's not about erasing you, Dad," I said, softening my tone slightly. "It's about ensuring your legacy survives. Sometimes the greatest act of leadership is knowing when to let go." He looked up at me, his expression hardening again. "Is that what you're doing in San Francisco? Letting go? Your assistant called here looking for you today. Seems there's some emergency with a client that requires your immediate attention." The abrupt change of subject caught me off guard. "That's being handled, is it? Because it sounds like you might need to make a choice, Vanessa. Your career or this family obligation you've taken on." It was a calculated pivot, shifting the focus from his resistance to my divided loyalties. Classic Theodore Pierce, always. Finding a way to regain the upper hand in a conversation. "My priorities are clear at the moment," I replied carefully. "I'm here until Pierce Manufacturing is on stable footing." "Are you?" He studied me intently. "Because Nathan mentioned your firm is pressuring you to return, that you might lose a major client if you don't go back immediately. I made a mental note to be more discreet with Nathan in the future. I'm handling the situation." My father leaned back in his chair, a strange expression crossing his face. "You know, you remind me of myself at your age. Driven, uncompromising, convinced of your own rightness." His tone made it unclear whether this was a compliment or criticism. "We're not as different as you've always tried to make us," I acknowledged. "But there's one important distinction. I've built my career without leveraging family connections or expecting others to sacrifice for my vision." The moment the words left my mouth, I regretted their sharpness. My father's face closed off, the brief vulnerability I'd glimpsed disappearing, behind his familiar mask of cool authority. "I think we're done here," he said, turning his attention to papers on his desk in a clear dismissal. "The board votes tomorrow. We'll see which vision for Pierce Manufacturing prevails." I left his office feeling deflated. For a moment, it had seemed like we might reach some understanding, some acknowledgement of the genuine concerns on both sides. Instead, we had retreated to our respective corners, the distance between us as vast as ever. My phone buzzed as I walked down the hallway. David Chen again. With a sigh, I accepted the call. "Vanessa, I need an update," he said without preamble. "The partners are meeting in 2 hours. What do I tell them about Westerfield?" "Tell them I'm making a decision by tomorrow morning," I replied, stepping into an empty conference room for privacy. "I'm in the middle of a critical situation here, David. The board votes on a new CEO tomorrow, and it's—" "Vanessa," he cut me off, his voice uncharacteristically stern. "I don't think you're understanding the gravity of this situation. Phillips is talking about reassigning all your clients. Your position on the partner track is in jeopardy." The bluntness of his statement hit hard. I had spent 8 years building my reputation at Maxwell Financial, working 60-hour weeks, sacrificing personal relationships and any semblance of work-life balance in pursuit of partnership. Now, all of it was at risk. "What exactly are you saying, David?" He sighed heavily. "I'm saying if you're not on a plane back to San Francisco tonight, I can't guarantee there will be a position waiting for you when you do decide to return. That's the reality." The ultimatum hung between us, stark and unambiguous. My time for delaying a decision had run out. "I understand," I said finally. "Thank you for being direct." After hanging up, I sat alone in the conference room, the weight of the choice before me almost crushing in its magnitude. San Francisco represented the independent identity I had built for myself. Success on my own terms, recognition based on merit rather than family connection. Portland represented unfinished business, family obligation, and a chance to finally prove myself to a father who had never fully seen me. But it was more complicated than that simple binary. My work at Pierce Manufacturing had evolved beyond proving something to my father. I had come to care about the company itself, the employees whose livelihoods depended on its survival, the legacy that extended beyond Theodore Pierce's ego. And there was something else, a growing realization that despite my protests, Pierce was part of my identity too. The company I had distanced myself from was nonetheless woven into the fabric of who I was. I was still contemplating these complexities when Nathan found me, concern evident on his face. "There you are. Dad summoned the executive team for an emergency meeting. I think he's making a last-minute push for Forrester." "Of course he is," I muttered, gathering my things. "When?" "Now." Conference room A. I followed him down the hallway, mind racing with possible countermoves. "Who's attending?" "All department heads, plus Jack. Dad's framing it as a meet the potential new CEO session, but it's clearly meant to solidify support for Jack before tomorrow's vote." It was a shrewd tactic. If the executive team publicly backed Forrester, it would put additional pressure on wavering board members concerned about a smooth transition. "We need to be in that meeting," I said as we quickened our pace. "Make sure it's a balanced discussion rather than a coronation." When we arrived, the room was already full. Department heads seated around the table, my father at the head with Jack Forrester at his right hand. All conversation ceased as we entered. "Ah, Nathan, Vanessa. Join us," my father said, his casual tone belying the strategic nature of the gathering. "I was just introducing Jack to the team. I thought it would be helpful for everyone to get acquainted before tomorrow's decision." I took a seat opposite Forrester, noting the absence of any materials about the other candidates. "Will Diane Mercer and James Whitaker have similar opportunities to meet the executive team?" My father's smile tightened fractionally. Given the time constraints and the strong support Jack has already garnered from the board, I thought this particular introduction was most pertinent. "I see," I said evenly. "Though I should note that no candidate has secured majority support from the board yet. Tomorrow's vote remains open." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. The department heads, most of whom had worked under my father for years, shifted awkwardly, caught in the crossfire of family tension. Jack Forrester, ever the polished executive, smoothly stepped into the breach. Perhaps I could share some thoughts on my vision for Pierce Manufacturing, and then address any questions or concerns the team might have. For the next 30 minutes, he outlined his approach. A vision that, unsurprisingly, aligned perfectly with my father's interests. He spoke of honoring Pierce's traditions while making careful, targeted improvements. He emphasized continuity over change, stability over innovation. Most tellingly, he repeatedly deferred to my father's wisdom and legacy, making it clear who would truly remain in charge if he became CEO. When he finished, my father invited questions from the team. There were a few softball inquiries about specific operational concerns, which Forrester handled with practiced ease. Then Sandra Johnson, the operations manager who had been refreshingly candid during my initial assessment, spoke up. "Mr. Forrester, with respect, many of us on the front lines have been concerned about Pierce falling behind competitors technologically. Your plan seems light on modernization investments. Could you elaborate on your approach to updating our manufacturing processes?" It was exactly the kind of substantive question Forrester had been avoiding. He glanced briefly at my father before responding. "Sandra, that's an excellent question. I believe in thoughtful, incremental modernization that doesn't disrupt what's working well. Ted and I have discussed potential areas for targeted investment, but I'd want to thoroughly evaluate current operations before committing to specific changes. It was a masterclass in saying nothing while sounding reasonable, the kind of non-answer that had allowed Pierce Manufacturing to delay necessary upgrades for years, while competitors forged ahead. If I might add, I interjected, feeling a responsibility to present a more complete picture. The financial assessment I've conducted indicates that substantial modernization isn't optional. It's essential for Pierce to remain competitive. All three CEO candidates recognize this, but they differ in their approach and timeline. My father's expression darkened. I think we're getting sidetracked. This meeting is about introducing Jack to the team, not debating specific strategic initiatives. But isn't that exactly what the team needs to understand? I countered. The strategic direction each candidate would take, so they can provide informed input to the board? Before my father could respond, his assistant appeared at the door. Mr. Pierce, there's an urgent call from Martin Webb at First National Bank. He says it can't wait. My father frowned, clearly annoyed at the interruption of his carefully orchestrated meeting. Tell him I'll call back in 30 minutes. He was quite insistent, sir. He mentioned something about reconsidering terms. The bank's threat to reconsider financing terms was exactly what my father had been trying to prevent. He excused himself reluctantly, shooting me a look that suggested he suspected I had somehow orchestrated the call. With my father temporarily out of the room, I seized the opportunity to provide balance to the discussion. While we're waiting, I'd be happy to answer any questions about the other candidates or the overall CEO selection process. For the next 15 minutes, as my father handled the bank call, I gave the executive team a fair overview of all three candidates, emphasizing their different strengths and approaches without showing obvious preference. I could see that several department heads were genuinely interested in the possible directions Pierce might take under different leadership. When my father returned, his expression was grim. He ended the meeting abruptly, citing the need to prepare for the next day's board vote. As the team filed out, he gestured for me to stay behind. That was the bank, he said once we were alone, Nathan lingering by the door. They've heard rumors about internal conflict over the CEO selection. They're concerned about my continued influence preventing necessary changes. What did they say exactly? I asked, surprised by his candor. That their continued support is contingent on seeing meaningful leadership change, and that their definition of meaningful apparently doesn't include appointing a close associate of mine. His expression was a complex mixture of anger and resignation. They specifically mentioned your restructuring plan as a condition of ongoing financing. It was a significant development, external validation of exactly what I had been arguing for weeks. The bank, unlike the board, had no emotional attachment to preserve my father's control. They cared only about Pierce Manufacturing's viability and their loan recovery. The bank is right, Dad, I said, trying to keep any hint of triumph from my voice. Pierce needs a clean break and a fresh approach. That doesn't mean erasing your legacy, but it does mean embracing real change. He looked at me for a long moment, then turned to gaze out the window at the manufacturing floor below, the physical manifestation of everything he had built over 4 decades. I need to think, he said finally. The vote is tomorrow morning. We'll see what the board decides. As I gathered my things to leave, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Vindication that external reality was finally breaking through my father's resistance, but also a surprising sympathy for what he was facing. For a man who had defined himself by his company for 40 years, truly letting go would be like losing a part of himself. Outside in the parking lot, as Nathan and I walked to our cars, the weight of my own decision pressed down on me again. The deadline David had set was approaching, and I still hadn't decided whether to return to San Francisco or see the Pierce Manufacturing transition through to completion. You okay? Nathan asked, noticing my preoccupation. Just thinking about tomorrow, I replied, not ready to share my personal dilemma. It's going to be close, he said, misunderstanding my concern. Dad won't give up easily, even with the bank's pressure. I nodded, my mind already elsewhere. I know. Get some rest. Tomorrow will be decisive one way or another. As I drove back to my hotel, my phone rang again. This time, my mother's number appeared on the screen. I answered, putting her on speaker as I navigated evening traffic. "Hi, Mom. Everything okay?" "Your father just called," she said without preamble. "He sounds different, subdued." "What happened today?" I filled her in on the bank's position and its potential impact on the CEO decision. It might finally be the external pressure that forces him to accept real change. "He's struggled with this more than you know," she said after a moment. "It's not just about control for him, Vanessa. It's about purpose, about meaning. Who is Theodore Pierce without Pierce Manufacturing?" It was a profound question, one I suspected my father had been avoiding confronting for years. He's still the founder, still the visionary who built it. That doesn't change just because someone else takes the operational reins. In theory, no. In practice, she sighed softly. Your father has never been good at separating his identity from his achievements. Coming from my typically circumspect mother, this was unusually direct criticism. Has he talked to you about tomorrow's vote? Only that it will be close, and that you've been... She hesitated, clearly editing whatever term my father had used. Influential with the board. I couldn't help but smile slightly at the diplomatic phrasing. I've presented the financial realities and the qualifications of all candidates as objectively as possible. The board will make their own decision. And what about you, Vanessa? Her tone shifted, becoming more personal. Nathan mentioned your firm in San Francisco is pressuring you to return. I suppressed a flash of irritation at Nathan's continued sharing of my private matters. I have some decisions to make, yes. What's holding you back? She asked perceptively. Before, it seemed clear your career was your priority. What's changed? It was the question I had been asking myself for days. I'm not sure, I admitted. Maybe I feel responsible for seeing this through. Or maybe you care about Pierce Manufacturing more than you've let yourself acknowledge, she finished for me. Her insight struck uncomfortably close to the truth. Maybe, I conceded. But caring about the company doesn't mean I can derail my career for it. No, it doesn't, she agreed. But understanding what you truly want is important, Vanessa. Don't make a decision based solely on proving something to your father, either by staying to win his approval or leaving to prove your independence. Make it based on what matters to you. It was remarkably similar to the advice she had given me earlier, yet it resonated differently now, with concrete choices before me rather than abstract possibilities. I'm trying to figure that out, I told her. By tomorrow, I'll have to decide one way or the other. After we hung up, I sat in the hotel parking lot, engine off, staring at the blank screen of my phone. 2 calls I needed to make. One to Marcus Westerfield, one to David Chen. 2 paths diverging before me, each with its own consequences, each closing doors that might never reopen. The decision before me went beyond career considerations or family obligations. It was about identity, about who I was and who I wanted to become, about whether I could integrate the parts of myself I had kept rigidly separated for so long, the independent financial expert and the daughter of Theodore Pierce. As night fell over Portland, I finally made my choice. The morning of the board vote arrived with unexpected clarity. I'd made my decision the night before, calling both Marcus Westerfield and David Chen to decline returning to San Francisco immediately. Whatever consequences awaited my career, I would see the Pierce Manufacturing transition through to completion. Arrived at the office to find Nathan waiting outside the boardroom, anxiety evident in his posture. Dad's been here since dawn, he said. Last-minute lobbying for Forrester. The boardroom filled gradually, tension thick in the air. My father entered last, his expression unreadable as Janet Fletcher called the meeting to order. "Before we proceed to voting," Janet said, "are there any final statements?" To everyone's surprise, my father raised his hand. When he spoke, his voice carried an unfamiliar note of resignation. "Pierce Manufacturing has been my life's work," he began. "Yesterday, I received a call from First National Bank. They've made it clear their continued support depends on meaningful leadership change." He paused, visibly struggling. "While I still believe Jack Forrester would serve the company well, I recognize that external perception matters. Therefore, I'm withdrawing my advocacy for Jack's appointment and will support whomever the board selects." Stunned silence followed his statement. This wasn't the impassioned defense everyone had expected. Whatever internal battle he'd fought, overnight had resulted in unexpected surrender. Nathan spoke next, with candor that startled me. "I was raised to lead this company, but never wanted the role. I accepted it out of obligation, not passion. Our current difficulties reflect, in large part, my limitations as a leader." He straightened in his chair. "I fully support bringing in an outside CEO with fresh perspectives." The voting process was brief. Janet announced the results with ceremonial gravity. "Our new CEO, pending acceptance, will be Diane Mercer, with 6 votes. James Whitaker received 3, and Jack Forrester 1. My father nodded once, accepting the outcome with surprising grace. The meeting concluded with practical discussions about transition logistics, my father participating constructively despite his evident disappointment. As board members departed, I approached him. "Thank you for supporting the board's decision." "The bank didn't leave much choice," he replied, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Diane Mercer is qualified. The company could do worse." "Will you stay through the transition?" he asked unexpectedly. "Yes. I've extended my leave from Maxwell." Something flickered in his expression, surprise perhaps, or reappraisal. "You're risking a lot for Pierce Manufacturing." "I'm seeing my commitment through." He studied me for a long moment. "Perhaps you're more like me than either of us has been willing to admit." "Maybe in some ways," I acknowledged. "But I hope I've learned from your mistakes as well as your strengths." Rather than bristling, he surprised me with a short laugh. "Give Diane Mercer 20 years, and your children can learn from her mistakes too. That's how it works." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of transition activities. Diane Mercer accepted the position and proved as impressive in the role as her interviews had suggested. My father maintained a careful distance, focusing on his new role as chairman while treating Diane with professional courtesy, if not warmth. As the critical phase of the transition neared completion, I prepared to return to San Francisco, not to Maxwell Financial, where my position had been eliminated, but to rebuild my career elsewhere. 2 days before my departure, my father summoned me to his office, now relocated from the corner, suite that Diane occupied, to a smaller but still elegant space down the hall. "Your mother tells me you're leaving Thursday," he began. "The critical transition work is complete. Diane has things well in hand." He nodded, pushing a thick manila envelope across his desk. "Before you go, there's something you should know. 3 weeks ago, after our disagreement about the CEO candidates, I made some changes to my will and the company's succession plan." A chill ran through me as I opened the envelope. I scanned the documents quickly, then more carefully, certain I had misunderstood. The will divided his personal assets equally between Nathan and me, a significant departure from previous arrangements where Nathan had received the bulk of the estate. The succession plan was equally surprising, granting Nathan and me equal shares in Pierce Manufacturing. "Equal shares," I said, disbelief evident in my voice. "Between Nathan and me. With your mother retaining her 15%? Yes. Nathan will remain with the company as Chief Strategy Officer. You'll have a board seat if you want it, but no operational role unless you choose to return someday." "Why?" I asked simply. He considered the question carefully. Because you were right. About what the company needed. About my reluctance to let go. He paused, searching for words. And because you sacrificed for Pierce Manufacturing when you didn't have to, when it cost you something valuable. It was perhaps the most direct recognition he had ever offered of my professional worth. And it had come only after I had opposed him, forced change he resisted, and prioritized the company's health over his control. Thank you, I said finally. Not just for this, but for supporting the transition. He nodded, then surprised me further by sliding a business card across the desk. Martin Webb at First National. He handles their corporate advisory division. He was impressed by your work here and is interested in discussing opportunities with you in San Francisco. You did this? I asked, unable to hide my surprise. I made a call, he said casually. The rest was your reputation, your work. It was a gesture I would never have expected, using his connections not to control, but to create opportunity, to acknowledge sacrifice rather than demand it. As I stood to leave, he spoke again. Vanessa, what you did here, forcing necessary. Change even when it was unwelcome. That took courage. The company is stronger for it. Coming from my father, it was high praise indeed. I accepted it with a simple nod, understanding that for both of us, understatement often carried more weight than effusive recognition. 6 months later, I sat in my new office overlooking San Francisco Bay, the glass walls of Webb's strategic advisors reflecting the late afternoon sun. After several conversations with Martin Webb, I had accepted his offer to help establish a new division focused on family business transitions, leveraging both my financial expertise and my first-hand experience navigating such complex changes. Phone buzzed with a text from Nathan. Board meeting went well. Diane's first 2 quarters showed strong results. Dad actually complimented her strategic plan. Apocalypse may be imminent. I smiled, typing back, document this rare celestial alignment for posterity. His response came quickly. Already framed and mounted. When are you coming up for the holiday party? Flights booked for the 15th, I confirmed. Our exchanges had an ease that had been missing before. The shared experience of challenging our father had created a new foundation for our relationship. As I set down my phone, my assistant appeared at the door. Your 4 o'clock is here. The Westlake family, transitioning their 3rd-generation manufacturing business. As the Westlakes entered, father, daughter, and son, their body language telling its own story of family dynamics, I rose to greet them with the confidence of someone who understood both the financial complexities and the emotional undercurrents of their situation. Before we begin, I said after introductions, I'd like to share a perspective that might be helpful. 6 months ago, I was sitting where you are now, but as both the outside advisor and the founder's daughter. What I learned is that transitions like this aren't just about financial strategies. They're about identity, legacy, and finding new ways for each generation to contribute value. Later that evening, driving home along the bay, I reflected on the journey of the past year. My phone rang through the car's speaker, my mother calling to confirm holiday plans. Your father mentioned you might bring someone? She asked. Jason, I confirmed. If that's all right. We've been seeing each other for a few months. Of course. Your father's looking forward to introducing you both to the new management team. The casual mention of my father's anticipation of my visit, so different from the strained formality of our past, was another indicator of changed dynamics. How is he? I asked. Really? Adjusting, she said thoughtfully. He and Diane have reached a working relationship, and he's mentioned your firm a few times, the work you're doing with family businesses. I think he's proud, in his way. It wasn't a complete transformation. Theodore Pierce would always be who he was, demanding, controlling in the areas he still influenced, challenging to please. But there had been movement, evolution, and growth on both sides. As San Francisco's lights twinkled against the darkening sky, I drove toward home with quiet confidence. I had saved my father's company and been threatened with removal from his will, only to be restored in a way that acknowledged my value rather than defining it. The painful journey had led not to estrangement, but to something more valuable. Authentic. Relationship based on mutual respect rather than obligation or control. I had discovered that removing toxic patterns from my life didn't necessarily mean removing people. Sometimes it meant establishing new terms of engagement that allowed for growth on both sides. And that, perhaps, was the greatest freedom of all. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.